morning. I want to begin by recognizing we're on the traditional territory of the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations and thank them for the ability to meet on their land. And thank you all of you for joining us today for the release of the province's first quarterly report for 2021. You'll remember last week I presented public accounts, which was a look back over the 1920 fiscal year. And today gives us a quarterly snapshot on the current fiscal year. Like public accounts, once again, we'll be able to see that COVID-19 has challenged and changed our province. We all know that the world is a very different place today than it was when I tabled February's budget, when we saw a modest budget surplus was realistic. Today, the pandemic is taking an economic toll in all parts of the world, as governments have lost revenue and significantly increased spending to help people in need. In the April to June period, which is the period that is covered by these public accounts, or by these quarterly report, the Canadian economy saw the largest contraction on record. Our neighbor to the east, Alberta, is forecasting a more than $24 billion deficit for this year. And the U.S. economy and the Eurozone saw their largest economic declines on record in this April to June period. Economic data suggests that the global economy could face its largest contraction ever on record. Just as we're seeing globally and in Canada, BC's economy and everyday lives for businesses and the people of our province have been seriously impacted. As we closed our businesses and our schools and our social circles, we came together, but we stayed apart to stop the spread in our communities. As government, our priority was to help everyone in British Columbia through this pandemic. These unprecedented times have called for unprecedented investments. We moved quickly here in BC to have one of the most supportive, comprehensive action plans in the country. It's an action plan that included tax cuts and credit increases, rent supplements, relief on bill payments, income assistance boosts, tax payment deferrals, and worker benefits. Today's first quarterly report updates the July scenario that I presented with additional data to show an economic and fiscal update. It also includes an update on the investments we've made to meet people's needs. We already know that COVID-19 has impacted almost all of BC's revenue streams. And in the first quarter, we're forecasting a fiscal year-end deficit of $12.8 billion. The province's revenue forecast has declined, though less than we anticipated in the July scenario. And the additional investments we're making in COVID-19 relief measures through critical health and social services and immediate financial relief are letting us help people and businesses quickly. What I've said from the beginning still holds today. BC is well positioned to move into economic recovery while continuing to focus on providing support to people and businesses and communities. People will know I don't sugarcoat situations. I'm a realist, but I'm also optimistic when it's warranted. And there are some early positive signs of recovery for people and for businesses. We see this in the latest employment data, an improved retail sales outlook, and some resiliency in the housing market. But again, being a realist, we have a long road ahead of us. And with that, I'm going to move into the specifics of the first quarterly report for 2020-21. So as I mentioned, the first quarterly is on track with the scenario presented on July 14th, with some improvements in employment, retail sales, and housing activity. We see a decline in GDP of 6.7% in 2020 and lower revenue of $4.6 billion in 2021, with a partial economic recovery in 2021. Q1 also includes $7.7 billion in increased spending for pandemic response and other expenses. It also includes our capital projects were built in to the 2020 budget, again, that are proceeding as part of BC's historic capital plan. There is a significant increase in borrowing, but our province's debt remains affordable. Next slide. So before I get into the economic forecast for our province, I just want to take a moment to go through some of the indicators that we've been tracking. Similar to other economies globally and in Canada, our economy, as I said, has been impacted greatly by COVID-19. You can see it when you look at the job losses and the impacts to businesses. Now, since the July 14th economic and fiscal update, we have seen indicators that have shown improvements. And I'll start with the labor stats, as you can see on this slide. After seeing significant job losses in March and April, we have seen signs of improvement. BC, at the beginning of COVID, in March and April combined, lost 396,500 jobs. In the months of May to August, the BC's economy regained 246,900 jobs, or roughly 62% of the total number of jobs lost since February, as the economy started to reopen. That's, again, a very good positive sign. But I think it's important to recognize and to remember that there are still 149,600 fewer jobs in August compared to February. That's a drop of 5.9%. So overall, the unemployment rate in BC was 10.7% in August, up from 5% in February. Next slide. The job losses have also been widespread when you're taking a look at where it has been hit in our province. We know that COVID doesn't impact British Columbians equally. We know that it discriminates based on age, based on gender, based on income levels, and based on the sector that you work in. So if you take a look at this slide, you can see employment declines since February have mainly concentrated in the service providing sectors, with declines, of course, in wholesale and retail trade, information, culture and recreation, business, building and other support services sectors, and accommodation and food services sectors. Among the good producing sectors, job losses since February have mainly been concentrated in the construction sector, around specialty trade contractors and those working on the construction of buildings, as opposed to other types of construction like roads or bridges or those areas. Also important to note the demographics when it comes to job losses. Youth and young adults are heavily impacted. This is in part, of course, because they're overrepresented in restaurants and retail services, but we saw employment among persons aged between 15 and 24 decline by 41,000 jobs from February to August. So their unemployment rate rose sharply from 9.1% in February to 22.6% in August. That's a significant increase. We have again started to see some very cautious positive signs. The youth unemployment rate is trending down from the high of 29.1 observed in June. Women are another area that have been, another group that have been more impacted by COVID-19, again because they tend to be overrepresented in the service sectors hit hard by the pandemic. So it's also important to note, of course, that women face society expectations that they bear the brunt of all the caregiving, and so many women face the reality of having to stop work because of childcare, caring for seniors, or caring for loved ones. So just on the specifics for women, employment among women in BC declined by 72,900 jobs, the February to August time period again, and women's unemployment rate rose from 4.8% in February to 9.9% in August. Again, a very large increase. And again, we're starting to see some positive signs. We're starting to see the unemployment rate for women trend down from the high of 14.4% observed in May. Next slide. So if we take a look at the retail sales data, June is the most recent data that we have from StatsCan, which is showing a rebound in consumer spending. BC's nominal retail sales saw the largest monthly decline on record in April, and as restrictions started to ease as we went into the restart in May, you saw retail sales rebound, and that's shown in the line above that you can see on the chart. Retail sales were 0.2% lower in June compared to February 2020, so again, a very strong rebound. Year over year, gains among retailers in June have been broad-based, with only sales at clothing and clothing accessory stores and gas stations down from a year ago. So again, a very strong rebound. Important again to look at the trend over the year. These are early signs, but early positive signs. We saw sales, as you can see from the chart, at food and beverage stores, building and garden stores, electronics and appliances, all up in the month of June year over year. Next slide. Continuing on with the indicators that we're looking at. This shows you the housing market, which again is showing real resiliency despite the pandemic. We know that there were big drops in March when we saw physical distancing measures, we saw halting of open houses across the market, but activity swiftly returned in May as we started seeing some of the restrictions ease. We also see home building continuing to be resilient. So housing starts are averaging 36,994 annualized units since February. Again, very high levels that we're seeing and resiliency in the market. Next slide. So this slide shows you the private sector forecasters, and it shows you that significant impacts are expected all across provinces this year, with recovery gains expected next year. So on average, as we do when we take a look at our budget, we look at an average of 6 private sector forecasters. They expect BC's real GDP to decline by 5.4% in 2020, as shown on the chart on the left, and grow by 5.2% in 2021, as shown in the chart on the right. So this is certainly, again, better than the expected decline of 6.4% on average for Canada, and similar to the 5.2% growth that's expected nationally for 2021. And among the 4 largest provincial economies, BC's real GDP is actually expected to decline less in 2020, and so as a result doesn't rebound quite the same extent as other provinces in 2021 because the drop isn't so great in 2020. Again, consensus projections for 2020 show major global economies having significant declines this year, with partial recovery again expected next year. And just to give you a little bit of a global feel, the August consensus forecast for the U.S. Forecast the GDP in the U.S. to fall by 5.2% in 2020, grow by 4% in 2021. Japan is forecast to decline by 5.3% in 2020, grow by 2.5% in 21. And the Eurozone economy is projected to contract by 7.9% in 2020 and grow by 5.7% in 2021. And that, of course, those are numbers for other jurisdictions, but that, of course, has a major impact on British Columbia, on our international merchandise exports, which again continue to decline because of weaker global demand and declines in commodity prices. Next slide. So turning to the forecast that we're using, the Ministry of Forecast Economic Forecast, this slide compares our forecast to that of the Economic Forecast Council. Typically, we would do a survey of the 13 members of the Forecast Council during the budget process, as I mentioned. But because of the uncertainty, because of the unprecedented times that we're in, we actually resurveyed the Economic Forecast Council in advance of this first quarterly report. We felt it was important to do that, as I said, given the kind of uncertainty that's out there. So the ministry is forecasting the economy to contract by 6.7% in 2020 before expanding to 3% in 2021. And again, you hear me use this word whenever I present the budget and documents. This again is prudent. We've built in prudence given the uncertainty that's out there. Built in prudence compared to the Economic Forecast Council decline because of the unusual circumstances that we're in. Next slide. So this table shows some of the details of the economic forecast. It shows what we are projecting in budget, then the scenario that we presented July 14th with the information that we had in July 14th, and what we're projecting now in the first quarterly report. So assumptions, people often ask what assumptions we've used in preparing this. We've assumed, again, the middle ground, as I call it, that we used in the July scenario, not the worst case scenario, not the best case scenario. Assuming a second wave will occur, assuming that physical distancing measures stay in place, global travel remains restricted, and that businesses are impacted for some time to come. The forecast also assumes that consumers and businesses will exhibit caution in their spending over the next while, reflected in labor market, consumer spending, business investment, and corporate profit projections. And we also, of course, expect that global trade will continue to be impacted. So you can see the ministry forecasts BC's real GDP to decline by 6.7% in 2020 and grow 3% in 2021. We also forecast BC's nominal GDP to decline by 6.5% in 2020 and grow by 4.8% in 2021, which is higher than the scenario that we presented in July, and shows that improvement, again, related to the statistics I talked about, the data I talked about at employment gains, retail sales, and housing activity, along with higher than expected inflation. When it comes to employment, again, the ministry forecasts employment to decrease by 7.8% in 2020, followed by growth of 3.6% in 2021. Again, building in prudence. We have seen some very positive signs. I certainly hope that we surpass these numbers, that we see the unemployment continue to drop. But again, we build in prudence given the kinds of challenges that are out there. Similarly, with consumer spending, again, we expect year over year we will continue to see a decline with lower income, with some consumer confidence, before picking up next year as we start to see employment numbers rise. And the housing market, again, it's been very resilient given the pandemic, and that has been revised upward from our July scenario as well. Next slide. So you hear me say this often, but I think it's important as we go into economic recovery to recognize that BC was in a very strong fiscal position before the crisis, surpluses over the 3-year fiscal plan, the best debt matrix, and credit rating compared to other provinces in Canada. And this forecast reflects, of course, as I said, the unprecedented impacts of COVID on all of the province's revenue streams. And it also includes the additional measures that we put in place to provide support for people and businesses through the economic recovery. Those of you who have seen these first quarterly reports come forward before will know that often we include a further fiscal year. This year, because of the high degree of uncertainty and the depth and duration of the pandemic, the first quarterly report presents a forecast update for the current fiscal year only. So compared to Budget 2020, as you can see from the slide, revenues are lower by $4.6 billion and expenses are higher by $7.7 billion. The result, as I mentioned at the start, is a deficit projection of $12.8 billion after incorporating a forecast allowance, so again, building in prudence, of $1 billion. The forecast allowance at the budget, when I tabled it in February, was $300 million. We have added to that to make sure that we have $1 billion put aside in our forecast allowance. Capital spending remains almost unchanged, a bit of a decrease just around timing of projects and when they come in. And because of the lower revenue and increased spending, taxpayer-supported debt at the end of 2021 is forecast at $59.8 billion, an increase of $10.6 billion compared to the budget. And of course, the debt to GDP ratio also changes because of that borrowing, and I'll talk a little bit about those specifics on the next few slides. Next slide. So just to look at revenues, revenues are projected, as I said, to be $4.6 billion lower than budget, as declines in own source revenue are partly offset by an improvement in federal government contributions. The impact of COVID-19 has touched on almost every area, as you can imagine: personal and business incomes, retail sales, purchases of fuel, housing market. All of those have dropped compared to predictions in the budget in 2020. The lower tax revenues incorporate the $800 million in relief provided to British Columbians. And again, I'll talk a little bit more about those pieces as we go along and look at the specific slides. We also see over $2.1 billion lower income tax revenues, and again, that's related to a drop in personal income tax revenue, down $978 million due to the employment and personal income losses. Corporate income revenue down more than $1.1 billion, which again is lower payments based on the federal outlook when it comes to the profits that we'll be seeing over the next while. $1 billion loss in sales tax revenue, which again looks at retail sales based on what was in budget to the numbers now. They are expected to decline 10.8% in 2020 compared to 4% growth, which was in the budget. And then, of course, consumer expenditures on durable goods. I talked about some increase in retail sales, but if we look at the big ticket items like automobiles, appliances, furniture, that can be about 20% of the PST revenue we get in, and we're seeing a big decline in the large purchases. So we're forecasting them to rise by 1.7% rather than, which compared to the budget is about a 19.5% decline. $1 billion loss in property and property transfer tax revenue. Again, property transfer tax revenue is $350 million lower because of the impacts of COVID, and property tax revenues are lower as well because of the commercial property tax decreases, the supports that we provided, lower speculation and vacancy tax revenues as well based on the budget numbers that were in there. Other tax revenues also forecast to be down by about $600 million. That would include fuel and carbon tax revenues, of course, the lower demand for gasoline, for diesel, for natural gas. Employer health tax revenue is lower. That's, of course, due to business payrolls, which are lower because of employment loss because of the pandemic. Natural resource revenue is projected to be down, again, as the effects of the pandemic reduce global trade. Natural gas royalties are lower, mining royalties and revenues are down, electricity sales are lower. We have seen an increase in forest revenues because of rising lumber prices, which are expected to result in higher stumpage. Revenue from fees, investment earnings, and miscellaneous is expected to, again, be below budget. And this is mainly due to the impacts of COVID-19 on international student enrollment, for example, in post-secondary institutions. School districts, reduced transit ridership, which again has an impact, of course, and reduced student presence at post-secondary institutions. So less activity when it comes to book sales, when it comes to accommodation, things that bring in the revenue. Reduced activities at BC Place would fit in there as well. Crown Corporation net income is forecast to be lower by $933 million. Again, closure of casinos, closure of pubs, restaurants, and other establishments shows a decrease there. The forecast for ICBC net income remains the same as budget because we have seen potential savings from the effects of fewer accidents in the first quarter of the year. That is expected to be offset by increased risks and uncertainty for the remainder of the year. So there's no change at that piece, and there's no change at BC Hydro's numbers as well. Federal government contributions, they're projected to be about $2.4 billion, again, mainly due to COVID relief funding, including the Safe Restart, the COVID funds, and again, I'll talk a little bit about these specifics as we go along. Just for your information, the forecast doesn't include BC's share of the federal government funding to help provinces and territories open schools safely. You know, we've already announced those dollars. We get those dollars in 2 installments, in the fall and the second in 2021. So again, once the determination has been made around what dollars come out of the fiscal year, those will be built in, and you'll see that in the second quarter report. Next slide. So just looking at the changes to expenses for fiscal 2021, expenses are higher by $7.7 billion compared to the budget. And this, of course, is due to the measures that we put in place for the COVID-19 pandemic, which I'll talk about the specifics as we go along. This just gives you the summary of the expenses at a very high level. $5.8 billion in supplementary estimates for critical services, for immediate financial relief, economic recovery, and federal provincial cost share measures. The total voted appropriation available is $6 billion. As you know, the $5 billion that we announced in March and the additional $1 billion that we talked about and that we voted on in the legislature over the summer. And that includes the $5.8 billion, reflects the $800, you'll remember the federal government is sharing, cost sharing with us. We have reached tentative agreements, still more specifics to come, on about $810 million of that $1 billion with the federal government. government. That will include funding for everything from transportation to TransLink, to municipalities, to ferries. Specifics will come out when those negotiations are complete. They aren't yet, but they're getting close. And then we hope with the additional $190 million of that billion that we will see further cost share programs and further support from the federal government. So those dollars have yet to be allocated. One-time climate action tax credit is $500 million, $425 million for pandemic pay for frontline workers, 319 of that funded by the federal government, $310 million for collective agreements that have been signed. As you know, we still have a few collective agreements going out the door in this fiscal year. $297 million for wildlife management, prior year floods, $35 million, and you can see the other costs, emergency costs related to the pandemic. $780 million in spending recovered from third parties. That's mainly, again, the cost-sharing measures that are put in place with the federal government. And then $375 million lower net spending in service delivery agencies. This is mainly, again, in the education sector in response to lower tuition revenue, both K-12 and post-secondary. Next slide. So now I'll talk a little bit about the specifics around the COVID action plan and the measures that have been put in place. And this, of course, is an additional piece that normally wouldn't come, you wouldn't see in a. These are, again, additional pieces that have been approved by the legislature and that we wanted to make sure we provide an update on where that spending's going. So this is, as I said, an enhanced and additional piece beyond the Q1 reporting time period, but I felt it was important when we were bringing these the Q1 report forward to make sure that we provided the information. So as of August 31st, the provincial total value of COVID-19 measures is estimated to be at $7.6 billion. This includes, as I mentioned, the $5.8 billion for pandemic contingency votes, that's the two votes, $800 million related to statutory spending that ministries have been spending, and over $1 billion in other tax and revenue measures. We also implemented, as you'll know, $6.2 billion in tax and payment deferral measures, which is an addition to these dollars. Next slide. So this just gives you the specifics, and I'll start with the $5 billion fund. As you know, $5 billion, 52 pandemic contingencies, $3.5 billion notionally allocated for critical services and financial supports, and $1.5 billion notionally allocated for economic recovery. The critical services, as you will know, includes everything from health and mental health supports, temporary childcare supports, housing and meal supports for vulnerable populations, the initial K-12 restart funding, and other essential services covering everything from adults with developmental disabilities, vulnerable children and youth, family justice and victim services, and health. The financial supports, as you can see, include measures such as the BC Emergency Benefit for Workers. That's the one-time payment of $1,000. The $300 per month crisis supplement for income and disability clients, now extended to the end of December. Emergency financial relief for individual and business renters through the temporary rent supplement and the Canadian Emergency Commercial Rent Assistance, and then a number of funding programs, emergency funding programs for various organizations and sectors, everything from agriculture to parks operators, community tourism organizations, domestic pitcher providers, etc. Next slide. So other COVID relief measures include, as I mentioned, the $1 billion in contingencies for provincial federal cost share measures. That includes the 810 that I talked about that has been determined thus far in discussions, and the 190 yet to be allocated. We also have $761 million, as you can see from the slide, for COVID-related spending, which includes the one-time increase to the climate action tax credit that went out in July, pandemic pay for frontline essential workers in health and social services sector, hotel purchases to support temporary housing efforts for people experiencing homelessness, and emergency management costs, which support regional, provincial, and local governments in emergency measures. And that includes all of the travelers who are returning to British Columbia and the temporary support that we put in place there. We also have over $1 billion in other tax relief and foregone revenue measures. That includes, of course, reducing the tax rate for commercial properties by an average of 25% in the 2020 calendar year, delaying the planned carbon tax increase and other budget 2020 tax measures to April 1st, 2021. And then also the temporary wholesale pricing model for liquor licensees is also included in here. The ICBC-related fee relief measures, and also the adjusted fiscal targets to the Ministry of Forestry to make sure that we can get tree planting done during this time period as well. Next slide. We've also implemented, as I mentioned earlier, tax and payment deferrals. These include the student loan deferrals, the BC Hydro bill relief and deferrals, and a number of different tax and payment deferrals that provide administrative and financial relief to municipalities and businesses. These don't have a direct impact, a direct fiscal impact, because the deferrals, of course, are expected to be paid at a later date. However, there are indirect costs related to deferrals, and that includes increased interest on the deferral payments, potential defaults that may occur as we're looking at that. We haven't made any adjustments in Q1. However, we have included $10 million more for doubtful accounts in the Q1 to make sure that we've covered off a portion of that. And again, we'll be watching that as we go along in the year. Next slide. Total capital spending, as I mentioned, historic budget projected to be $10.4 billion, a little bit lower, as I mentioned, than forecast, as happens each year when you look at when projects go out the door and when they don't. Timing changes mainly in transportation and health. And again, we're committed to moving ahead on the capital projects that we have built in the budget. And you can see the projects on the slide, everything from the Patello Bridge to New St. Paul's Hospital, the Broadway subway line, Cowichan Hospital, 4-laning from Kamloops to Alberta, Stewart Lake Hospital in Fort St. James, Williams Lake Terrace, and the list is long, but really shows you the number of projects that are moving ahead in every corner of British Columbia, which again was already built into the budget and will provide us with some real strength because those are already funded and already out the door when it comes to economic recovery. Next slide. As I mentioned, we are forecasting an increase in provincial debt as a result of the unprecedented decline in revenue and spending needed for COVID supports. So you can see taxpayer-supported debt is forecast to rise to $59.8 billion at the end of the fiscal year. Taxpayer-supported debt to GDP is projected to end 2021 at 20.8% compared to 15.5% expected in budget when we tabled it. So certainly while we're seeing an increase in borrowing and higher debt levels, again, we're very well positioned in British Columbia to be able to borrow at low interest rates. And compared to debt to GDP ratios in other provinces, BC, for example, ended the last fiscal year with debt to GDP ratio of 15.1%, second lowest among the provinces, and certainly significantly lower than other provinces. Ontario, for example, ended their fiscal year with a 43.5% debt to GDP, and Quebec at 43.6%. So again, even with the increase in borrowing, we are very well positioned here in British Columbia. Next slide. So just to take a moment to look at the risks, I think it goes without saying that these are unprecedented times, and these are times that are very hard to predict what's coming ahead. And so we may see slower recovery because of a weaker global recovery. That's entirely possible. We may see a more negative impact to households and to businesses. We may see future waves of the virus, and that may have an impact. Crown corporations, BC Lotteries Corporation, for example, depending on casino closures, could have a longer-term impact. And so we'll be looking at all of those factors as we move into to not only our budget process, but obviously the next report that will come out in Q2. And so that's why, again, we've ensured that we built prudence into the budget because incorporating prudence, again, provides us with some support as we look at the uncertainties that are ahead of us. So just in closing, there is no question that COVID-19 has had a huge impact, an unexpected and huge impact on British Columbia, but across the globe. And I'm very proud of the fact that we moved very quickly as a government to make sure that we put a response together to put people first and to support businesses across British Columbia. Q1 shows that. It shows the investments that we've made in those supports, and it really shows again our aim in these investments in partnership with the federal government has really been to make sure that we help people and we help businesses to ensure a strong restart and a strong economic recovery. And as I mentioned, we're seeing positive signs. We're seeing the housing market pick up. We're seeing an increase in retail sales as people once again feel a bit more confident. We're seeing businesses reopen, and we're seeing rehiring of staff. We're continuing to see increases in employment with another 15,300 people hired in August. And we've also seen some local businesses even expand in the last few months. Just an example is the Thought Exchange in Rossland. They've seen their crowdsourcing platform usage increase by 600% since March. So the company's helping workplaces as they look at new ways of doing business, but they're also providing meaningful employment for people in the Kootenay region as the organization grows. No question we have a long way to go, but I'm feeling optimistic about BC's economic future. We have robust capital spending, as I mentioned, that's going to help us as we move ahead. We have one of the best debt affordabilities in all of Canada. And I've also seen people all over this province help each other, support local businesses, keep our neighbors safe, work together. And I know that the people of British Columbia are incredibly resilient, and they're going to show that kind of resiliency when it comes to economic recovery. Today's Q1 showed that we've started down the road to economic recovery. Now, in the next few days, next week, you'll hear from us as we unveil the province's economic recovery strategy as well. So thank you, and I'll look forward to coming back for your questions.
Thank you, Minister. As a reminder to everyone on the phone, we will now move into the tech portion of the question and answer, which is on background and not for attribution. First question is from Vaughn Palmer, Vancouver Sun.
Minister James, in the past you've commented that the previous government seemed overly reliant on the housing and sales sector, both housing sales and property sales, and also on housing starts. Do you see any irony in there, that being some of the best numbers you've got to report to us in this quarter as well?
No, I continue to feel that you don't build a sustainable economy on speculation in the real estate market to see the kinds of spikes that you see. That's why we put together our housing plan and our housing strategy. That's why we're looking at making sure that we add additional rental market, particularly to be able to help that moderation in the market. So that continues to hold, and I think the measures we put in place, I hope will address that as well.
Do you have a follow-up, Vaughn?
Yes, please. The Deputy Minister of Finance sits on the Site C Project Assurance Board for BC Hydro. Have you gotten any indication from her as to the likely financial impact of the troubles at BC Hydro, at Site C, regarding the stability issue in the foundations of that project?
I think, as you know, Vaughn, that report is still to come. I think I express, as the Premier has done, concerns with the initial numbers, the initial report that came out. We'll be waiting, obviously, for the independent report to come forward, and then the report from Hydro, and then we'll have more to say about that. But no question, as I said, I'll express concerns in the same way as the Premier has done and the Minister has done as well.
Next question is from Colton Davies, Radio NL.
Hi, Minister. You mentioned BCLC casino revenues. Do you see any possibility of casinos reopening this fiscal year? Alberta reopened casinos in the second week of June. BCLC has been developing safety protocols. Our mayor in Kamloops actually told us last week that he thinks the safety plans he's seen would meet the requirements of Dr. Bonnie Henry. And obviously, casinos provide gaming grant revenues for local governments like Kamloops to do community projects. So do you see any possibility of casinos reopening this year?
Well, again, just as we've done through the pandemic, I think it's been one of the greatest strengths that you've seen in our province. We follow the direction of Dr. Bonnie Henry, and we follow the public health orders. So I wouldn't second guess. That's something, again, that Dr. Bonnie Henry will be looking at and will await any direction, any changes. If they occur, they will come through the public health orders.
Do you have a follow-up, Colton?
Yes, thank you. Off topic, but we heard from Dr. Henry, Minister, earlier this week that nightclubs, banquet halls forced to close down, and obviously restrictions to selling liquor in restaurants. We've heard locally from some nightclub operators who have spent, some capital money, thousands of dollars, to be able to safely reopen, and are concerned that they're now having to close because of, a perception of COVID-19 cases in the Lower Mainland more so than Interior Health, for example. I'm just curious, could there be any sort of extra specialized support, available for operators, outside of, say, Fraser Health and Vancouver Coastal Health that could come online for somebody like this?
Well, I think, as you know, and as you've mentioned, businesses have been hit, particularly in the hospitality end. You see that in the results that have come forward from Stats Can as well around employment numbers. So we will be looking, and we are looking at all sectors, including the hospitality sector, as part of the economic recovery plan, and you'll hear about that shortly. That'll be coming forward shortly. But when it comes to differences across regions, I think you've heard both Minister Dix and Dr. Bonnie Henry talk about the importance of consistency across the province. And again, we'll be following those public health orders.
Bob Mackin, Breaker News.
Yes, good morning. Based on what the Premier said yesterday, this could be your last quarterly report as Finance Minister. Do you still plan to retire instead of run again?
I am retiring. As I announced back in March. I won't be running when the next provincial election occurs, but I've got a lot of work to do, Bob, well ahead of that. We have an economic recovery plan that's taken up the work over the summer after the session, and I've got a budget to build that's coming ahead of us, so lots of work still to go. And retirement for me will be moving on from this position, but not sitting still. I'm not very good at that.
Do you have a follow-up, Bob?
Yes, I do. You've opened up the public purse this year during the pandemic, during this emergency, wider than any other finance minister in BC history. Is there any extra funding for offices like the Auditor General, the Information and Privacy Commissioner, for the RCMP, or for other public bodies that whose job it is to make sure there's no waste and corruption?
We haven't increased existing budgets for the officers, for the independent officers. I think it is important just to touch on the accountability piece. It's why I brought forward the specifics around our plans and our spending through this process, even though it wouldn't normally be included in a Q1. Just as we had good discussions in the legislature about the specifics, we'll continue to update the public on those pieces.
Next question is from Richard Zisman, Global News.
Minister, can you give us a better sense of the ICBC financials? I understand that based on the Q1 projections, the revenue is $330 million or so over what was predicted in the first 3 months of the year. Is that largely due, obviously, to a decrease in crashes? And is there any sense about whether the insurer may be making some money this year?
Well, I'm certainly feeling, again, cautiously optimistic. It's very early in the year. This is the first 3 months. So as you point out, there's obviously an impact on the reduced travel that was going on during the months of April, May, and June. But I think, again, it's a positive sign about getting ICBC back on track. I think it's too early to say whether that's going to continue over the next year. We'll need to watch this next year, but it's certainly encouraging. It's a positive sign. As you know, the attorney brought forward some major changes to ICBC to make sure that every driver gets a break when it comes to ICBC. That passed in the legislature. And then I think the other important point to note is that those dollars, if there are dollars to be that will be made by the end of the year, the surplus by ICBC, those remain at ICBC to support drivers and to support the people who pay into ICBC because of the changes, again, we made in legislation. So those can't be scooped towards the budget. They actually get used to be able to reduce costs for drivers. So again, a positive all the way around.
Richard, do you have a follow-up?
I do. On another part of your portfolio, has there been any shift in government advertising and how much is being spent on government advertising? And again, with talk of an election looming, will there be a change in those expenditures?
Well, again, there are very clear rules when an election occurs, what happens to advertising, so that hasn't changed. Those rules remain in place. There has been, again, the specifics around actual spending in advertising comes out in public accounts, so you saw last year's. But we have ensured that the public health messages and supports for people, that those messages are going out. You may also know that we actually have a review process for all government advertising that occurs, regardless of whether it's an election year or not an election year. We have a process that we utilize where all of our ads have to go through the process to make sure they are nonpartisan, to make sure that they cover off the requirements for that, and that process is used on all of the advertising that we have in government as well.
Next question is from Lisa Cordasco, CHLY.
Thank you. Good morning, Minister. What is the status of the pandemic pay? I've been told that workers haven't received a cent yet, and there's no promise as to when they might.
We're very close. We hope certainly by October that people will see that come through. As you can imagine, it's over 200,000 people. It's a massive undertaking to make sure that we look at how much an individual has worked, therefore how much the pandemic pay comes out. But we're very close to those dollars going out the door.
Lisa, do you have a follow-up?
Yes, just on the retail sector, the numbers are down. That's a sector hard hit employment-wise, as I understand it. But yet the sales are good. So can you talk about, the sectors that are hit hardest by unemployment and why?
Well, I think, again, no question we saw retail sales rebound, as you saw in the slides. Whether that was simply pent-up demand, people getting out as the restart began, or whether that's a longer trend, that's something, again, we're going to have to watch very carefully. That's why you see prudence built in to the budget when it comes to estimates of unemployment as well. We've seen a couple of months where the numbers have been very good. To see over 60% of the jobs return that were lost in February is a very good sign. But again, if we get a second wave, if we start seeing those kinds of numbers shift again, we want to make sure that we're building that prudence in. So we continue to see, of course, tourism, accommodation, those areas very hard hit when it comes to the pandemic. And again, we're looking at how we provide support through both our economic recovery as well as long-term to some of those industries through the province.
We have one more question this morning, and that's from Shannon Waters, BC Today.
Good morning, Minister. I'm guessing some of this is going to be coming with the economic recovery framework. I'm wondering if you can provide an update on the timeline for that. But I'm also curious, kind of going back to what Colton asked about, we just had this new order from the provincial health minister that people who work in the hospitality sector are concerned about. They're worried that it's going to put, potentially thousands more people out of work again. Is the province considering further supports for individuals at this time, and is that something that you might be talking about when we get the framework update?
So again, just on the timeline for the economic recovery framework, that'll be coming out next week. So very soon we'll be able to talk about the specifics that are in that report, so I won't touch on the details of that report. Certainly I think it's important to note again, as you've heard the health minister, as you've heard Dr. Bonnie Henry, as you've heard me say as well, our most important piece when it comes to economic recovery is making sure that we're protecting the health and safety of British Columbians. People need to feel confident to be able to go into those businesses. They need to feel that we're addressing the issues of COVID-19 to be able to even spend their money in those businesses. So first and foremost are the health issues, and you saw some of that update yesterday from the Premier and Minister Dix around work we're doing to continue to build that confidence, and that will be important to the retail sector, to the bars and restaurants and others who have concerns. Again, building that confidence is going to be critical. So I'll wait and talk about the economic recovery pieces next week.
That's all the time we have. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.